This video is going to quickly look at some of the different approaches or perspectives in psychology. So what that means is there are lots of different ways to explain psychological phenomenon or to explain things that are going on in society. And depending on kind of like the lens that a person might take to explain it, it might show their approach. So today, the goal is actually to take a more complex approach, the biopsychosocial approach, where we combine several of these, but we're going to learn about them as individual approaches so that you guys can kind of see how each one might explain something differently. Okay, so there are 7 that we're going to talk about, and they're all from your book. So the first one is the biological approach. And if someone were to take this approach to explain something, they would really be looking at the body and the brain. So when I think about biological, I think like if I could cut it open and it bleeds, or if I could cut it open and study it under a microscope or something like that, that's the type of body and brain that we're talking about. We're not talking about necessarily the cognitive processing. That's going to be a whole different approach. Instead, we're going to look at how hormones in the body, how neurotransmitters or chemicals in the body, how different parts of the brain then connect to the things that we do as humans. So that's where the emotions, the memories, the sensory experiences come in. But they're not as focused on the emotions, memories, and sensory experiences. They're more focused on how the body is enabling those things, how the body is allowing or encouraging those things. So really focusing on the brain, the blood, the neurotransmitters, the hormones, the molecules, all of those things that you can look at. And then it gets a little more complex because it talks about how genes might combine with our environment to create differences between us. Okay, so again, when we look at genes, when we look at the genetic factors, that's also biological. So they're trying to figure out how kind of like that nature-nurture component combines in order to create what we see in individuals. So I'm going to use a simplified example here of how each one of these approaches might explain something like depression. And it's going to be extremely simplified. So let's say that you go to talk to somebody about having depression, and let's say that they take a purely biological approach. What might happen in that scenario is they write you a prescription for medication because their belief is depression is rooted in an imbalance of neurotransmitters in the brain. So they believe that if they give you medication, it'll balance out those neurotransmitters and that will treat your depression. That would be a purely biological approach. An evolutionary approach to explaining things, again, you kind of think like Charles Darwin, survival of the fittest, natural selection of traits, all of those different things. We're really looking at kind of like the survival of your genes over time. So they would actually have a tough time explaining depression because depression could be considered to be like a malfunction. But one of the approaches that evolutionary psychology would take to explaining depression is they would consider depression to be adaptive rather than a malfunction. And what they choose to focus on is that depression kind of like turns on certain molecules in your brain. So they would say that sometimes your brain has to turn on depression in order to preserve those molecules. So that's natural selection. It's actually helping to preserve certain things in our brain that will be adaptive and important later on. So the next approach is the psychodynamic approach. And for this one, it really is kind of like that Freudian approach that's a little bit complicated and we're going to learn a lot more about later. But people who take this approach, they really focus on how your unconscious, because we have all these different levels of consciousness, they really focus on how your unconscious is driving the disordered behavior that we might see. Okay, so they say that you have certain conflicts, unresolved conflicts, that might be kind of like fighting it out in your unconscious. They're things that you can't access, you are not aware of, but they're driving the behavior that we see. Okay, they do focus a lot on like childhood and parenting and stuff like that in terms of what those conflicts might be. So I don't know, maybe an example tied to depression. If you came in to be treated for depression or talked to about your depression by a psychodynamic theorist, what they're going to do is say that depression is a symptom of some sort of conflict that's going on that's unresolved. They know that you can't access that conflict. So what they're going to do is use kind of a variety of techniques that might help them try to determine what's going on in your unconscious, because they feel like if they can figure out the root of the conflict and resolve that conflict and make you aware of that conflict, that then it brings it into your conscious awareness and it could modify your current behaviors like depression. All right, so there are 4 more that we're going to talk about. The behavioral approach focuses on how we learn observable responses. The behavioral one basically does not focus on anything internal. It says that everything that we do is basically because of what we're experiencing in our environment. So it talks about imitating behaviors that we see. It talks about modeling our behavior after things that we see. So an example of that tied to depression maybe would be if you had a parent at home or a sibling at home that was depressed or something like that, and you may see and watch what they're going through, and you might see like the attention that they get, or you might see how it helps them not have to go to school or things like that. And so then you may model your behavior after that. Behavioral is actually way more complicated than that when it comes to depression. That's super, super simplified. But behavioral, again, is all external. It's not about necessarily how we process it in the mind. It's about sort of like imitation and modeling what we see in our environment, okay? The next one is cognitive. So it's sort of like the opposite of behavioral. Cognitive really focuses on the mind, not the brain. Remember how I said with biological, you could cut into your brain, you could kind of see all the stuff that's in there? That's not cognitive. Cognitive is how we process it. So how do we encode what we're seeing? How do we store it? How do we put it into memory? How do we pull it out? How do we make sense of it, right? So like what's going on in our mind, okay? How do we think about something? So when we talk about the cognitive approach related to depression, maybe if you have a lot of like negative self-talk throughout the day, a lot of negative thoughts and things like that, that would be something that fuels depression. So, a cognitive therapist might ask you to do things like keep a diary of all the negative thoughts that you have throughout the day. They might even ask you, as you get into the therapy, every time you have one of those negative thoughts, you have to think or write down 3 positive things about yourself or your experiences. So that would be an example of cognitive. Humanistic is kind of like warm and fuzzy. We're going to learn about a triangle or a hierarchy of our needs, and it talks about how we have all these little like needs that need to be met at each part of the triangle. And basically, if our lower level needs aren't met, then we can't kind of like move up the triangle to like full acceptance and self-fulfillment and things like that. It's called self-actualization. So basically, you need to have your needs met, like you need to have food to eat and you need to have a place to live and things like that. So that's kind of some of the basic level needs. And then you need to have people in your life. You need to have money or a job, some source of fulfillment, right? And you kind of move up throughout that triangle. So how they might explain or deal with depression is they would probably look at what needs do you have that aren't being met. And if you can find ways to get those needs met, then you would move into an area where you're better able to fully accept yourself, therefore helping deal with the depression. Our last one is social cultural. And this is really focusing on behavior and thinking. So it kind of combines the behavioral and the cognitive. And it's really looking at how does that change across situations and across cultures. So it's going to look at peer influence, for example, or media influence, or expectations of religion, or things like that that are going on in society. So if we're looking at depression, we would look at the extremely high rates of depression. And depression exists in every culture, but extremely high rates of depression, even here in America. So they might start to look at, okay, well, what are kids seeing on TV? What are the drugs that might be available? Are those impacting their minds or their experiences? Do they have the right friend groups? What's their family structure? So they're really going to look into all of those different things as they consider depression, okay? So what you guys are going to be doing today is using those 7 approaches, and you read about them and hopefully took notes on them. On the front table, There are 4 articles. They all come from one overall article. The article is titled The Power of Firsts, and it's really looking at why are our first experiences in certain areas so powerful? Like, what explains why we remember those, or why they stick with us, or how they might affect like our development in that particular area. So there are 4 topics. So it's the power of firsts in success, in loss, in love and sex, and in lies. So those are your 4 areas. You're only going to pick one. It's a 1-page article. What I want you to do is grab one of those articles and then grab the assignment sheet that goes along with it. What I'm asking you to do is actively read the article just for your own interest, but actively read the article and try to read it critically. Try to figure out what about what they're saying ties to any of the approaches. Are you seeing things that could be behavioral? So like they're successful because it's something that they saw and that they repeated. Is it something that's cognitive? So for example, they're experiencing a difficult time dealing with loss because of what's going on mentally and how they're getting through things mentally. Is it about friends and not having anyone there? So really, as you're reading the article, you're trying to read it critically to try to figure out what approach is this author taking to explain the power of firsts. And there are lots of different things you can pull out, and they're not going to be explicit. It's not written from a these are the approaches to psychology standpoint, okay? Nor are most things in life that you're going to read. So I'm asking you to read it with a critical eye and try to figure out what 3 approaches are either used at times in the article or that you could use to explain why your first experience is so powerful. So then I'm asking you to go through and fill out 2 sentence stems in terms of how, for example, how might the cognitive approach explain loss or explain love and sex. So I want you to kind of think through that, okay? This is due in class on Wednesday, so whatever you don't finish today becomes homework for Wednesday. There are no right or wrong answers. It's just making sure that you explain things correctly. So talk to each other. If you didn't understand my video explanation, then go online, look at other YouTube explanations. There are a lot of them that exist. Or go outside of YouTube and use your phones and Google things to make sure that you understand them, okay? When you come back on Wednesday, all of your notes from Chapter 1 need to be completed because we're going to be talking about all of Chapter 1 and we're going to be talking a lot about these articles on Wednesday.